Hi, today we're covering the Heaven's Gate cult. To get a handle on what Heaven's Gate is all about, we need to dive into the backstory of the guy who kicked it all off. Marshall Applewhite, born in 1931, and his upbringing was anything but ordinary. His father was a former soldier turned Presbyterian minister who got the young Marshall hooked on biblical prophecies from a young age. But it would not be until the 1970s that Applewhite went really into the prophecy gig. Now that may have been because it was being more and more popularized at the time, especially with the fears of an apocalyptic nuclear war coming. So by 1972, Applewhite found himself a job at St. Thomas University in Houston, Texas. In part because he had gotten the boot from other jobs, as it surfaced that he was irresponsibly cozying up to one of his male students. And that same scandal sent his wife of 16 years headed for the hills. Man, she must have felt humiliated. But all the way out of left field comes Bonnie Nettles. Bonnie was also going through a messy divorce at the time, and she just so happened to be a nurse. And depending on the story you get, apparently the two of them just clicked over their shared interest of biblical prophecy. Legend has it that they crossed paths at a hospital where Bonnie was on duty, and Marshall Applewhite was supposedly visiting a sick friend. However, reality is different, as this hospital wasn't your run-of-the-mill medical center, but an asylum, and it appears that Marshall Applewhite was not visiting a friend. It turns out that the man was a patient of the hospital himself. Eventually, Marshall would go on to tell Bonnie that they had crossed paths in a previous life. However, that's not even the strangest part. It appears that Bonnie would drop a bombshell on Marshall, stating that their encounter was foretold by aliens. What are the odds? And it seems that their shared beliefs in the paranormal or supernatural led them to dive headfirst into studying biblical texts, alongside works of psychiatrists and occultists, building the foundations of what would allow them to create Heaven's Gate later, in a manner that is oddly reminiscent to the foundations of Scientology. After their deep dives into scripture and some soul-searching, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie reached a, let's say, interesting conclusion. One which would lead me to believe they should have probably stayed at the asylum a little bit longer. They believed they were divine beings, blessed with supercharged brains by some cosmic extraterrestrial power. And according to them, they were the two important people mentioned in the book of Revelation. So from here, they started a pamphlet campaign in order to spread their interpretation of an end times religion. And in a manner that reminds me of Shoko Asahara, they would claim that Jesus Christ had made a comeback. However, rather than in Japan or Israel, he had made a comeback in Texas. Yes, apparently they were stating that Marshall Applewhite was in fact Jesus Christ. They would even go on a spiritual road trip across America, going to others' spiritual gatherings and churches in order to drop their bombshell conclusion that they were the two witnesses from Revelation destined to lead humanity, or the chosen, on a spaceship ride to something they would call the next level. Now, much to their surprise, after their grand announcements, they learned that it didn't really stick with the public. Instead of welcoming arms and a flock of faithful, they essentially kept getting the boot out of everywhere they went. They really didn't get the warmest reception. And to add insult to injury, their spiritual journey, this great pilgrimage, left them broke. And from here, things went from bad to worse, because Marshall would get picked up for car theft, landing him a nice spot in jail for half a year. After his release, Marshall and Bonnie realized that they needed to switch gears if they wanted to reel in some like-minded souls. So they took a more proactive approach by taking out newspaper ads. And unlike their previous attempts, this seemed to really work. Suddenly they were inundated with a bunch of eager believers who were all too willing to take a leap for the Texas Jesus Christ. From here, they would gather their newfound followers, dubbing them the ever-so-creative name, The Crew, because Spaceship Crew. Makes sense, right? Then, Marshall and Bonnie would lay out their theological assertions, essentially claiming that they were the witnesses mentioned in the Book of Revelations. And kind of like L. Ron Hubbard himself would claim, they were the representatives of a group of extraterrestrials. However, rather than Xenu, they would claim that they came from a place called the Next Level. And according to them, these alien bigwigs were scouting humans for an upgrade, promising an evolutionary leap. And just like that, the cult was born. They even came up with a rather creative name, Human Individual Metamorphosis, or HIM. It seems that Marshall Applewhite really thought he was him. As time went on and the group expanded, Marshall Applewhite would cross paths with a figure notable within the UFO scene, Hayden Hughes, to whom Marshall would spin a story about having telepathic abilities, claiming that Hughes could reach him through a secret code, praying to Bonnie using the Lord's Prayer. And I know this kinda sounds like it's out of the X-Men, but it's not. It was apparently their real belief that they had a telepathic hotline that could be accessed in such a way. Fast forward a bit, and a bunch of individuals vanished in Oregon after having attended a UFO talk. This got Hughes thinking, maybe he should try and contact the Applewhites. So he gave the secret code a try, and strangely enough, the next morning, he would receive a call from Marshall. Now this incident that I mentioned had occurred in 1975, and it was the same incident that would lead to Marshall Applewhite's group being in the headlines, as they hosted a big event at a hotel in Waldport, Oregon, and they were supposedly gearing up for a big journey. This was where the whole crew ditched their stuff and bid farewell to their old lives as they gathered in the hotel, and then poof, they basically vanished into thin air. The hotel staff even went so far as to contact the police, apparently freaking out about their missing guests. Even Walter Cronkite himself would go on to cover this disappearance, which in turn would stir up a frenzy, since it appeared that everyone was scrambling for answers, asking themselves, had the crew actually ascended to a higher plane? Were they victims of foul play? Or was there some other type of mystery afoot? And apparently, it wasn't some divine calling or an alien abduction. Marshall and his crew pulled this disappearing act intentionally, as they went off-grid in order to live their lives incognito. It was a bunch of people who thought they were enlightened beings, roughing it on the streets, begging for scraps, which is not exactly the best look or the behavior you'd expect from highly evolved entities who have a connection to the divine. But apparently, according to Marshall and Bonnie, it was all part of the plan to help their followers level up. And I know it sounds kind of like a video game, but that was their beliefs. And it seems this small group of anywhere between 20 to 70 individuals just dropped off the radar for a significant amount of time. They could not have family visits, no media scrutiny, so without either of those two, the cult could really indoctrinate them, as they painted it in the light of us against the world. They would even go so far as to ditch their old names and monikers. During their stint on the streets, Marshall and Bonnie would double down on their indoctrination even further than they had originally. With no prying eyes or authority figures, they were essentially free to mold the minds of their devoted followers however they pleased. It was brainwashing in a way that is honestly reminiscent of Charles Manson's own brainwashing of his so-called family. Believe it or not, despite being what one would assume was the leaders of a group of homeless, Marshall and Bonnie weren't just surviving. No, they were recruiting. Yeah, it seems that they were able to reel in even more people into the fold, as Marshall definitely had a knack for striking up conversations with potential recruits, now more successfully dropping the bombshell of him being basically Jesus' reincarnation or what have you. And get this, he would go on so far as to claim that his body was in fact the current vessel of the extraterrestrial that had once made Jesus so special. And apparently that worked. Regardless of how strange it sounds, some people actually just ate that up and they were joining left and right. Now personally I can't really figure out how a scruffy looking guy manages to roll up to somebody, claim that he has a direct line to Jesus, aliens, and spirits all in one, and get people to believe it. Then go further still, not just believe it, but sign up for their cult. However, anything's possible, and it seems Marshall was able to pull it off quite often. However, the wild ride of that status quo doesn't end there. It keeps going from the 70s into the 80s, and as it just so happens, the cult would keep growing. Prospective members were lured in by a combination of promises, including UFO meditation sessions dubbed meetings with the UFO to supposed conversations with the Christ. All throughout this, they would be discovering bombshells and being told that everything that they had once known was dead wrong, and that some sneaky human spirits were posing as gods. And while it sounds like the plot to a bad movie, it's not. It was a reality some people believed. As for who was joining up, it was really a mixed bag. You had your new agey hippy-dippy types, the people who were soul-searching, looking for a new way, a new path, something unconventional. However, there were some surprises, such as John Craig, a Republican who was attempting to gain a seat in the Colorado House of Representatives, who had decided to consider cult life as a potential option. That, or he was thinking maybe there would be a loyal voter base? I honestly don't know. But back with the rest of the cult, their numbers were swelling, and they would decide to rebrand from him to Heaven's Gate, and they shifted their practices to be more secluded, becoming a group of recluses. No longer would they be wandering on the streets, as they had found a cozy place to reside in, particularly Santa Fe, California, and they were able to procure a rather massive house, which they dubbed the monastery, for some $7,000 a month in cash. Now I bet you're wondering how a bunch of people who were living it up like nomadic hobos was able to afford that much money. Well, as it turns out, they had a rather lucrative side gig. They had formed a web development company known as Higher Source, which goes to show you that a cult can even get smart people to join them, seeing as they were able to essentially run, create, and improve websites. And it turns out that they were rather good at it, and they had their fingers in the creation of a myriad of websites, and so flush with cash that they could afford full-page ads in major newspapers in order to spread the good word of their cult to as many people as possible. But they didn't stop just there. They started selling insurance, alien abduction insurance to be exact, that would cover everything from abductions, impregnations, and even alien-induced deaths. And for some reason or another, people paid for it. I mean, I could get the novelty. I have alien insurance as an icebreaker, but you're paying for it. It honestly boggles the mind that anybody would do that. Now, like any other self-respecting cult, they had a doomsday prophecy, and theirs went as follows. The Earth was supposed to be coming up and be part of a great cosmic makeover, all courtesy of some alien overlords. And according to them, the only chance of survival was to level up your consciousness to what they called tele, also referred to as the next step of human evolution, and that only then could you hitch a ride on the alien spaceship, which would be the only way to truly access the next level, and that it was only Heaven's Gate who could help you accomplish this. Things get even more interesting around 1985, when Bonnie Nettles, Marshall's right-hand woman, passed due to brain cancer. Considering she was supposed to be one of the chosen ones who guided everyone to the cosmic promised lands, this put quite a wrench into things. However, with her death, Marshall quickly flipped the script, rewriting the prophecy in order to say that physical bodies were now optional for ascension, and that ascending would require you to leave your mortal coil, and that only your essence would truly hitch a ride on the cosmic alien mothership to the next level. Now, this should have been seen as a bad sign to everybody in the cult, but at that time it was a little bit too late. With the new iteration of the cult's beliefs, they started viewing their bodies as nothing more than vessels or meat suits, just temporary homes for their consciousnesses, which in essence gave them the green light to abuse their bodies as much as humanly possible, since it really didn't matter. But that's not the only negative that came out of this. Apparently, when Bonnie was on her deathbed, Marshall would not even bother to reach out to her family. Her own kids didn't even know she passed until much later. Imagine how awful it is to find out that your mother was on her deathbed and you were just a few hours away and never knew. It kind of shows just how controlling and domineering a force Marshall Applewhite was on everybody within the cult. Now let's move back to the cult's beliefs. How exactly does one reach an elevated state of consciousness? How exactly do you achieve Teller? Well, the first step in that is essentially cutting off ties with everything earthly, almost like a Benedictine monk. Getting rid of all your earthly possessions, saying permanently goodbye to all your friends and family, letting go of all the human quirks and cravings you would normally have, saying goodbye to your individuality, your money, your dreams, your aspirations, and even giving up your name. And to reach the supposed higher plane, one had to remove one of the biggest parts of being human, any and all urge for adult gratification, be it with another person or individually. And this might have been in large part because of issues Marshall Applewhite had with himself. The head honcho, who had grappled with his own sexuality for the majority of his life, really wished he didn't have to. Guy was struggling hard with his interest in men, especially since he had just recently lost the woman who had made it all make sense, which led him to taking some extreme actions, believing all sexual desire was the root of evil. So Marshall did the only thing he could think of. He went to Mexico and went under the knife, getting himself castrated to rid himself of these desires. And it wasn't just him. He decided that this was something he had to lead his followers into practicing themselves. So after getting the neutering treatment you normally give to a overly aggressive dog, a bunch of other guys in the cult, apparently completely on their own, disconnected from anything else, decided to get the same procedure under similar circumstances for the same reasons. This definitely wasn't another case of the cult leader exacting sexual control over his followers. However, instead of doing it in Mexico, they initially tried to save some money by doing it in-house. This was because one of the members of the cult was a nurse, and she figured she could do the castrations herself. And that backfired big time when she almost killed one of the members of the cult. But I mean, to them it was just a meat suit, and the repercussions of that body's death was meaningless to them in the long run. But because of the potential of bringing the authorities down on them, they decided to go the safer route and just visit Mexico for their castrations. Now that we know what they needed to do to reach the next level, let's go into what they believed the next level actually was. And it appears that they did not see it as a spiritual realm, but rather a physical planet, a paradise, if you will, where they would evolve into super beings, with no more pesky human desires, like hunger, or the physical desires an adult has. Nothing that makes you human would be there anymore. None of the flaws as they would see them. They believed that they would then survive on sunlight alone. At this point, they're selling themselves the idea that they would be Superman. And that's not all. They had some belief on others' religions too. According to them, all religions worship the same alien entity, but they were also warned about the Luciferians, aka false prophets, or in other words, people who might not be so comfortable with the cult's behaviors and their family members being a part of it. But much like Scientology paints outsiders as religious enemies of some great alien space opera, so did Heaven's Gate. And according to the cult, the Luciferians had been posing for generations as gods on Earth. They were supposedly these superhumanoids with hologram technology, time travel, telepathy, you name it. It was a Saturday morning cartoon villain type deal. They apparently had all this super powerful technology that could basically warp reality around them, but apparently Marshall Applewhite was so powerful and glorious that he would stop them, and he was willing to save you if you castrated yourself, along with following the cult's other beliefs. And the cultists were warned not to fall for the Luciferians' tricks, which including pointing out the cult was a cult, or that the cult's activities were harmful to their followers, or that Applewhite was not mentally all there. All these were activities that were related to the Luciferians. Heaven's Gate even had a classification of beliefs surrounding the idea of possession, but rather than spirits, it was aliens possessing the bodies of humans, which again draws strong parallels to Scientology. According to them, the body was vacant, and an alien consciousness would just stroll in and pilot it, like some fleshy mech suit, and they called this a walk-in. At one point, Marshall and Bonnie had even gone so far as to state that they weren't really Marshall and Bonnie anymore. They were aliens who had hitched a ride in their bodies. And once again, Marshall had claimed that the alien piloting his body and commanding his followers was the same one who had been in Jesus Christ. It's not just the fact that they believe in alien possessions, but that aliens were cherry-picking humans in order to reach the next state of evolution, ascension, or what have you. Those chosen few would be the select group that would become a transhuman type being. And while it's not one-to-one with Scientology, it feels a lot like it. These similarities are too close to just be a coincidence. There has to be some connection. And how do you secure a spot on this cosmic spaceship? Well, in Heaven's Gate, it was by following Marshall Applewhite's teachings. So of course, all of his true believers would be holed up in their commune, sharing chores, swapping stories, and being all smooth down there. It honestly feels like it would fit in a cheesy B to Z grade sci-fi film. They eventually began producing videos in order to share their bizarre beliefs. And yeah, they were still performing the castrations even then. But let's focus on the videos. So what happens when you're one of the lucky few, or many, who get one of these Heaven's Gates indoctrination tapes? You're a new recruit, you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and ready to soak up the cult's wisdom. Then you sit down to watch the video. But what unfolds is a pure, unadulterated amount of weirdness that feels like a drug trip. Marshall Applewhite will take the stage in these videos and deliver his message straight from the cosmos. The gist? Basically, the planet Earth is about to be recycled, the end is nigh, weird imagery, how anyone sat through that and said, oh no, this guy looks like he's on the up and up. It makes perfect sense. It's just beyond me. Now, while all this was going on, there were some very coincidental and opportune cosmic events brewing. In particular, something known as the Hale-Bopp Comet. This was a celestial rock which was hurtling through space, discovered in 1995 by two eagle-eyed astronomers. And it just so happened that Hale-Bopp was making its grand tour past Earth at this time. And this icy behemoth was some 25 miles across, weighing millions and millions of tons. And it was spewing out water vapors and gas, all the while lighting up the night sky in a spectacle. And apparently, it was fortuitous enough that this comet would swing around Earth roughly every 2,000 years. A real celestial event, which luckily for the man calling himself a reincarnation of the Christ, or an embodiment of the alien which made the Christ, this would have been roughly around originally when Jesus was around. So it coming back again honestly just fell on Marshall Applewhite's lap. Because the moment he caught wind of it, he started making his way around saying his new theories, that this wasn't just an ordinary space rock. No, it was a sign that harkened back to 2 millennia ago. And according to Marshall, this comet was more than just a celestial body. It was something hiding a bigger secret. A secret that only Heaven's Gate would tell you about. Apparently it was an alien mothership. Yep, you guessed it, this was the mothership that was to take them to the next level. Apparently the ship itself was hiding in the comet's tail, and as the comet would swing by the Earth, lighting up the night sky, it would give the aliens the opportunity to pick up their chosen. But the morbid part comes in next. Apparently, to catch a ride on the mothership, all they had to do was ditch their mortal coils. Translation: for their mass departure, they needed to commit mass self-termination. It wasn't going to be an ordinary trip. There was no coming back from it. It was one way to the next level. But how were they planning to make the leap? Well, in their eyes, it wasn't self-termination, since their bodies were just vessels piloted by their true selves, which apparently were aliens who had decided to limit themselves to human bodies for some reason, but now wanted to not limit themselves to human bodies. So the real self-termination in their eyes would be to refuse the cult of the mothership. Now, as a countdown to their cosmic journey ticked on, the cult would get down to some serious business. Each member would record their final farewells, expressing their eagerness to embark on this grand cosmic adventure, a grand tour if you will. They spoke passionately about reaching the next level, where their enlightened minds would soar above the alien mothership. Marshall Applewhite decided to seize this moment and craft his own farewell message, all the while referring to himself as Doug, which was a moniker that was used prominently by his followers. And he would go on to state, "Some call our partnership Tiendo, but that is not my name. That is how I am referred to on the planet Earth at this time. In his message, Applewhite hinted at his otherworldly origins, suggesting that he hailed from a distant area in space, perhaps even another dimension. Honestly, he sounds like somebody who watched too many isekais, but they didn't really exist back then. He solemnly proclaimed that their earthly mission was drawing to a close, and they were on the brink of returning from whence they came. According to Applewhite, once the comet was gone, Heaven's Gate would shut down for good, that their time was running out, and that the cult had mere days to exit their earthly vessels or risk missing their chance at ascending to the next level. As the cult prepared for their final departure, they made sure to spread their message as far and wide beyond their immediate circle as they could. Copies of their farewell tapes were dispatched to former members and anyone else affiliated with the group, ensuring that their message would endure beyond their time on this earthly realm. Eventually, a man named Rio de Angelo received these tapes, and he was so alarmed that he took immediate action. He would drive straight to the monastery to check on the cult. Knocking on the door yielded no response, so he would venture to the back and found it unlocked. As he stepped inside, he was met with a ghastly scene: the lifeless bodies of all 39 official cult members. Horrified, he wasted no time in alerting authorities. The police arrived swiftly, and they launched an investigation. What they uncovered was a meticulously planned mass self-termination. The cult members had ingested a lethal concoction of phenobarbital mixed with applesauce and chocolate pudding. Then they washed it down with vodka before sealing their fate by placing plastic bags over their heads, inducing their own deaths by both poisoning and asphyxiation. While mass self-termination by poisoning wasn't uncommon in doomsday cults, Heaven's Gate seemed to take things further still, with their symbolic, ritualistic approach to this matter. This was a methodical and very well coordinated act which set them apart from other tragic endings, like Jonestown. During their solemn act of mass self-termination, the cult members adhered to a striking uniformity. They were clad in matching tracksuits adorned with red patches which read Heaven's Gate Away Team. Each member wore Nike Decades sneakers as well. This uniformity was a visual testament to their shared unity in purpose, and their self-terminations unfolded meticulously over the course of 3 days, beginning on March 22nd, 1997. The cult members divided themselves into 3 groups of 15 individuals. On the first day, 15 would commit the act, and another 15 on the second. Then the final 9 on the third day would include their leader, Marshall Applewhite. After each group committed their final act, any remaining members were tasked with ensuring their dignity in death by carefully removing the plastic bags from the deceased's heads and arranging their bodies in their beds with their arms folded and a ceremonial purple cloth being draped over each body. Additionally, each member was adorned with a symbolic gesture, a $5 bill and a roll of quarters placed in their pockets. Some would interpret this as a symbolic fare for boarding their mythical ship, much like the coins placed on the dead of ancient history. However, there was another symbolic meaning to this. The significance behind this harkens back to the time when the cult committed their original pilgrimage across America. The cult had a rule to keep $5 in bills on their persons and a roll of quarters to pay for any phone calls they had to and any fines they would run into. This rule was a relic from their homeless days, and it seemed to become a part of their cult's rituals and practices, remaining long past their purpose. And if you're too young to know why a roll of quarters would be needed, that is how you paid for a payphone back in the day. Now, the significance of the Nike Decades worn by the cult members during their mass self-termination is not as profound as one might expect. It honestly just boils down to the cult got an awesome deal on a bulk order of shoes. That's it. The decision to wear the Nike Decades was just economical, nothing fancy. On the other hand, Nike has remained tight-lipped about any connection between their shoes and Heaven's Gate. And despite the speculation surrounding their involvement, the company has refrained from outright commenting on the matter. However, shortly after the mass self-termination of the Heaven's Gate cult, Nike discontinued their 1993 version of the Nike Decades, which is unfortunate because I kinda like the shoe. Nevertheless, Nike has continued to produce more modern versions of the Nike Decade, and it's still a rather popular and comfortable shoe. As for the aftermath involving the police, police officers would deploy several trucks to transport the bodies. And if it makes anybody feel any better, Marshall Applewhite, their cult leader, was one of the last to die, essentially dying alone, surrounded by rotting dead bodies. Well, there are suspicions that he was one of the last 3 to die, due to 2 of the bodies not being in a ceremonial position and still having plastic bags over their heads. It is speculated that the last 2 surviving members were the ones to put down Applewhite before their own ends came. The news quickly picked up on the mass self-termination, and this sent shockwaves across the nation, which at the time was having shockwave after shockwave after shockwave. From Ruby Ridge to Waco, Texas, to the North Hollywood shootout. Bad things just kept happening. Even the Unabomber, all 1990s. In another tragic turn, it seems that another 3 members who weren't living at the monastery also self-terminated, hoping to join Applewhite and the others aboard the supposed Comet Tail spaceship. This mass self-termination, in essence, decimated the cult, either directly or indirectly, as horrified remaining members of the group decided to distance themselves and completely disconnect from Heaven's Gate. However, amidst this devastation, there were 2 individuals, Mark and Sarah King, who remained loyal to the cult, and they are the only 2 well-known surviving members to this day. And why were they spared from the mass self-termination, you ask? Well, as it turns out, Applewhite singled them out to stay behind on Earth for a rather peculiar reason. They were to stay and maintain the Heaven's Gate website. Mark and Sarah were essentially only alive because somebody needed to run the website, a duty that they upheld for decades. And surprisingly, this website still works, so the legacy of the cult still lives. The Heaven's Gate tragedy serves as a poignant reminder of the dangers that arise when individuals are led astray by someone who is clearly struggling with some amount of mental illness. And while some may believe in unconventional ideas, there is usually some degree of empathy and understanding in their beliefs. However, it seems that Heaven's Gate took things to another level, one that there was no return from. Imagine being told by a former mental patient that he was a witness from the book of Revelations, possessed by the spirit of Jesus Christ, or rather the alien who possessed Jesus Christ all the many years ago. And what was the only path to salvation that this former mental patient claimed existed? Well, cutting off your own genitals and boarding a spaceship by eating poisoned pudding and applesauce. And the fact that people believe this is beyond surreal. In hindsight, history shows us that cults with doomsday prophecies will often implode, either by causing their own demise or by fizzling out due to being wrong. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate stands as a stark example of this, a cautionary tale to the dangers of unchecked beliefs taken to an extreme. If you remained with me until the end, I thank you, and I do hope you stay tuned and subscribe for more content.